History tends to explain wars in clear terms: strategy, security, necessity. Nations act because they must. But occasionally, the timing of a war raises a different kind of question, one that the official record does not always address directly. In the archives, patterns appear not only in what happened, but in when events begin to align, not about whether the conflict was real or whether the stakes were serious, but whether something else was unfolding at the same moment: a scandal, a crisis, a point of vulnerability for those in power, and a leader who suddenly has reason to shift the public's focus somewhere else. We begin in 415 BCE, in a city defined by debate, ambition, and naval power. Athens at this moment was powerful, wealthy, and deeply confident. It had survived war. That openness made Athens dynamic. It also made Athens unstable. Public life in Athens was shaped by assemblies, juries, public accusations, and constant political competition. One of its most prominent figures was Alcibiades, charismatic, persuasive, well-connected, and widely viewed as unpredictable. He could attract admiration and suspicion at the same time, which made him politically useful and politically dangerous. By this point, scrutiny of his conduct had begun to intensify. He was not simply controversial because he was ambitious. Athens was full of ambitious men. What made Alcibiades different was the sense that he treated rules as obstacles rather than limits. For supporters, that made him bold. For rivals, it made him dangerous. Ancient writers describe a reputation shaped by excess, spectacle, and disregard for restraint. Then, shortly before a major expedition, Athens experienced a coordinated act of destruction. Religious boundary markers, known as herms, were defaced across the city. Heads were damaged, faces broken. Symbols of civic and spiritual protection had been attacked overnight. These were not ordinary statues. Herms were stone boundary markers, usually topped with the head of Hermes, and placed throughout the city at doorways, intersections, and public spaces. To damage them was not just vandalism. It suggested disorder at the level of the city itself. The destruction created fear, confusion, and immediate suspicion. In a highly religious and politically anxious society, the mutilation of the herms could be interpreted as a bad omen, a coordinated act of impiety, or even a signal that conspiracy was already underway. That is why the response was so intense. The city saw not just damage, but threat. Alcibiades became one of the central figures in the accusations. The charges carried serious consequences, and a formal trial was expected. At minimum, his political future was in danger. At worst, the accusations could become fatal. At the same time, political discussion began shifting toward external action. The proposal was the Sicilian Expedition, a massive campaign aimed at expanding Athenian influence far beyond the Aegean. It was expensive, risky, and controversial. It also offered something politics inside Athens did not: a new object for collective attention. The assembly debated whether the city should commit ships, money, and men to a distant war. Some Athenians warned that the campaign stretched too far. They argued that the city was taking on unnecessary risk and leaving itself exposed. But Alcibiades was one of the most persuasive voices in favor of the expedition. He framed it as expansion, prestige, and opportunity. In the assembly, ambition could sound like strategy, especially when spoken confidently. The expedition was approved and Alcibiades was appointed as one of its commanders. That appointment mattered. It moved him physically out of Athens just as legal danger was closing in. He was no longer only an accused citizen. He was now part of a major military undertaking. His position had changed from defendant under suspicion to military leader with public responsibility. The fleet departed, and Alcibiades left Athens. But departure did not erase the accusations. The investigation continued behind him. The scandal did not disappear. It simply ceased to be the city's only urgent story. The distance between the city and the accused commander grew, but the political threat remained. He was later ordered to return and face the charges. He did not. Instead, he defected. That choice is revealing on its own. It suggests that the legal danger at home was serious enough that flight looked safer than judgment. The story moved from accusation to war to betrayal. The expedition ended in defeat. The loss weakened Athens significantly and permanently altered the balance of power. The accusations against Alcibiades were never made irrelevant, but the war changed scale, priority, and perspective. What had once looked like a central crisis now competed with military disaster. A similar shift in attention appears in another empire, centuries later. In Rome, the political system was different, but the logic of public perception still mattered. Power depended not only on force, but on image, legitimacy, and control over blame. By 64 CE, Nero's rule was already under strain. Ancient sources describe a ruler associated with extravagance, controversy, and instability. Some of those sources are hostile and must be handled carefully. But even allowing for exaggeration, the broader picture is clear. Nero's position was not secure in the way imperial propaganda liked to suggest. Then, a fire broke out in the city and spread rapidly through dense urban districts. Large sections of Rome were destroyed. Homes, shops, and neighborhoods were lost. In a city of extraordinary density, fire was not only destructive. It was socially destabilizing. It displaced people, created panic, and immediately raised the question of responsibility. And that question mattered, because emperors were judged not only by what happened under their rule, but by how they appeared during crisis. If a ruler seemed absent, indifferent, or implicated, the damage became political as well as physical. The destruction created a serious challenge for the leadership. Some ancient accounts suggest Nero himself was blamed, whether for negligence, ambition, or something darker. Those accounts are debated. But the important point is not certainty. It is that suspicion existed, and suspicion on that scale creates pressure. Nero redirected attention toward a minority group, shifting focus away from the leadership and toward an internal target. In practical terms, this meant transforming a question about imperial responsibility into a question about enemies within the state. That is a powerful political move. In the following years, Rome became engaged in a major conflict in Judea. The causes of that conflict were complex, local, religious, political, and imperial. It would be misleading to reduce the war to events in Rome, but it would also be naive to ignore how large-scale conflict can reorder attention inside an empire, already trying to manage blame and instability at the center. These two cases are not identical. Athens was a democracy. Rome was an empire. Alcibiades was an ambitious political actor under accusation. Nero was a ruler managing imperial suspicion. But the sequence in both cases is notable: a moment of vulnerability, followed by a shift in public focus. This sequence appears across very different historical settings. This does not prove intent, and it does not reduce wars to a single motive. History is rarely that neat, but timing still matters. It shapes perception, it affects what institutions prioritize, and it can determine which crisis becomes central and which one is pushed to the edges. The consequences of those shifts often extend well beyond the initial scandal. When internal pressure builds, leaders may begin to prioritize stability over transparency. External events, especially violent or expansive ones, can shift public focus quickly. The underlying problem does not disappear, but it may no longer receive the same scrutiny it did before. Attention does not have to be controlled perfectly to be redirected. It only has to move. In these moments, the public often turns toward what feels immediate. Military danger, visible destruction, and the language of emergency can overpower slower questions about accountability. That does not erase the earlier crisis. It changes its position in the hierarchy of concern. Over time, earlier events may fade from immediate attention, even while remaining in the record. This is why timelines matter so much. When events are viewed together, rather than in isolation, patterns become more visible. What looks accidental in the moment can appear structured in retrospect, not because every conflict is invented, but because crisis often rearranges attention. In some cases, leaders facing consequences may benefit when attention shifts elsewhere, not because the underlying issue disappears, but because it is no longer the dominant story. And in politics, that alone can change what survives, what stalls, and what is forgotten. Time changes how events are understood and how responsibility is assigned. This does not mean every war is a distraction. History is more complex than that, but timing remains an important question. Why now? Why this sequence? And what was pushed out of view when the larger crisis arrived? Next time on the Footnote Files, we explore the shadows of the Atlantic, the mystery of the lost colony. Join us as we look beyond the legend.